And I'm sorry, I can do the intro again with the recording. I just remembered it now when I flipped back from the other one. But just to say the last part again, I'm pretty sure you embody what the future of modern Orthodoxy is all about. And I'm so excited to have you with us. Sofia, the floor is yours, and you can also share your screen if that's something you want to do.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm sorry it was a little bit shaky at the beginning with the internet, and thank you so much for all being here tonight. I really appreciate it. Okay, well, happy Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan to everyone. I guess that's how we'll start. So there's a lot of different things that we in theory could talk about. We just had Tishrei. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things there isn't really anything to talk about because it's Cheshvan. There's nothing going on. So that's exactly what I want to be talking to you about this evening. I'm going to put this source sheet that I made in the chat here. If it's okay, like John said, I'm also going to share my screen just in case that's difficult for people to balance both of those things. So I'm going to do that in a second. Okay. Awesome. All right. Hopefully everyone can see. Amazing. I can see all of your little animals on the top for our Google Doc. Amazing. So we're going to talk about consistency, which is a word that I would like to aspire to in my life more often. I'm sure a lot of us here might feel that way. And I want to explore the nature of consistency throughout halacha. I want to explore the value of consistency that's explained throughout the Gemara, throughout the Sidur. And hopefully with that, we can think a little bit more intentionally about what this month ahead can look like after feeling extremely exhausted from the holidays. And hopefully that can be like a helpful takeaway for you throughout all of this. So that is our roadmap for the evening. So, okay, the first source that we have here, just as a little bit of a reminder for us, make it a little bit bigger, is what exactly Cheshvan is. We have to go back all the way to Elul, and I have source here from the Mishnah Torah from the Rambam reminding us about what Elul is supposed to be. In describing the blowing of the shofar, the Rambam explains that the point of the shofar is to wake us up from our sense of normalcy and consistency there, and have an opportunity to take a step back and think, oh, like I should maybe be doing my life differently. But that was Elul, and that was Tishrei, and that's not where we are anymore. So that was the way I kind of want to set this up, because when you think about what kind of sources or mikorot exist for Cheshvan, there aren't any. For exactly this point, there is nothing going on. So that is where I wanted to start off. Before we go into specific details and fun halachot about this, I'm curious what kind of feelings are evoked for you when I say the word consistency. I'm going to guess that it's probably not the most exciting, but if anyone wants to share any personal anecdotes about that, so we know kind of what we're bringing into this space. If you want to share it, you can probably just jump in, I'm guessing.
Sofia, it's Rebecca, and I wasn't going to say anything with that, but if you just tie it in, we do refer to Cheshvan as Mar Cheshvan. And I'm just wondering how you would tie that into not having any sort of any.
Yeah, that's a good question, Rebecca. Also nice to see you. I will say, I'll wear my mother's academic hat for a second and say the term Mar Cheshvan, although it technically means bitter Cheshvan, it actually is the Babylonian term for that month, and like it was one word together. Now we understand it as like, oh, it's so sad we don't have any holidays. That's why Cheshvan is so bitter. But that's originally what it meant. So I didn't put it on there, but I think you're right to point out that I think maybe with consistency or that there's idea that there's like a lack of excitement going on. It's boring. So I think that is a helpful emotion for us to be thinking about, regardless of the origin or not. So thank you for that. Yeah, Dahlia. Hi.
So hi. So I was thinking that the value of consistency may be that this is the month where we just remember to daven every day, and that Shabbos is also important. And you know, like that, maybe it's a reminder that not everything is about the big events, the big holidays, that just every day we have to be a good Jew. Every day we have to do chesed and mitzvot and learn. And so that's what consistency means to me.
Yes, right. I think that you're bringing up a helpful point. That doesn't have to be sad that there's no holidays. Judaism is still filled with lots of other exciting opportunities for routine and even something like Shabbat. And that's still there. I feel like Shabbat kind of became exhausting over the past month. When we were thinking about like it being, like Chag, a few days later, Shabbat, a few days later again. But you're right, like now we get to have Shabbat on its own, not tainted with anything else going on. And that's really great. And we get to enjoy that on its own now. So that's great. Yes, Dr. Yurwitz Freudenstein.
I just wanted to share a phrase that I learned today, which apparently is not a new one that I mentioned to you before, that I'm sneaking in. Moadim la shigra, so which obviously a play on Moadim la simcha. And so it's something about like shigra is a routine, like an everyday routine. So I think it's a kind of a play on similar to what Dahlia said in terms of making sure that the everyday has a feel of a moed or specialness to it, via mitzvot and or mindset or otherwise.
Yes, I think that is a funny one. Rebecca, do you want to say something else?
Yeah, I would just say, to add to what they're saying, is we just come out of this month, and if you think about it in terms of what was meant to be in Eretz Yisrael, going up to Yerushalayim, as much as upheaval as we have, even with one day, it's a very hard. It's a hard month. It's a hard month, I think, no matter who you are. Probably in the old days when you were traveling, that added another level of upheaval to people's lives. So I think I just wanted to add to what they're saying is to you compare that to what everyday life. And I think that reinforces the importance of consistency or some sort of regularity or sort of normalcy, maybe.
Yes, I think this makes a lot of sense that you'd say this also, Rebecca, considering like the posse of grandchildren that were with you throughout Sukkot. Like as much I'm sure that was great, I'm sure it's like a little bit quieter in the house now. And that's lovely.
I'll take that wonderful mayhem and chaos any day.
I'm sure. So with that, I want to talk a little bit more about consistency. And I want to do that with a really beautiful, it's kind of like an Agadata. There's the source for it is quite new, but it's like written like an Agadata of the past. So I think we're just like a little bit unclear where the source is from. But it's from the beginning of the Ein Yaakov, which is a collection of Agadot. And that was collected, I think, only a few hundred years ago. And the discussion is, what is the most important pasuk in the entire Torah? So kind of similar to the story that maybe you might be familiar about when people approached Hillel on one foot. What is the most important thing in the Torah? And what pasukim does that entail? It's kind of a similar story. And with consistency in mind, let's see what it says. So that is the next source, Introduction to Ein Yaakov. So we're listing people. Ben Zoma Omer, Matzinu Pasuk Kolel Yoter V'hu Shema Yisrael V'Gomer. Okay, Ben Zoma says this pasuk that we say at least once or twice a day, or even before bed, that it would make sense to say Shema is the most important verse in the Torah. So the reminder that we are monotheistic, that God is our God. That makes a lot of sense. That would be the most important pasuk. The next one, Ben Nanas Omer, Matzinu Pasuk Kolel Yoter V'hu V'havta L'recha K'mocha. So similar to I think that this discussion about the 1 foot, like what is the most important pasuk? To love your neighbor as yourself. There's so many values in the Torah that have to do with loving and caring for one another, and also yours taking care of yourself. So it makes sense that this would be the most important pasuk. But then Shimon ben Pazi Omer, Matzinu pasuk kolel yoter v'hu et hakeves ta'achad ta'aseh b'boker v'gomer. And so Shimon ben Pazi says a pasuk that might be surprising to us, which is a pasuk that we read every Rosh Chodesh actually, which is the first lamb you shall sacrifice in the morning, and the second lamb you shall sacrifice in the evening. Not the most exciting of psukim, not as, in theory, theologically significant as the other ones. It doesn't really feel as good. And yet this is the most important pasuk to him. And then it ends, Amad Rafloni al Raglav Vamar Halacha Keben Pazi. So after all of these discussions, what's the most important pasuk? The conclusion is that Ben Pazi's approach, which was that the pasuk about the korbanot is the most important pasuk, is the one that encapsulates all of what Torah is. So it seems here that there's a lot that could be unpacked. It doesn't seem that it's about the nature of sacrifice, but more so the nature of how the sacrifices are given. And this one is specifically the Korban Tamid, the one that you give every single day. And that is the pasuk that is being focused on. That what is the most important part of the Torah? what encapsulates all of Judaism, the ability to give to God and do the mitzvot every single day, the roteness of that experience. That's probably what is the most important in the Torah. Before we move on to maybe what that means, does anyone have any reactions to that story?
I just want to say, this is Ahava, sorry, I'm very not camera ready at the moment, that I think it's so interesting that the criterion is kolel yoter, more inclusive, right? That there's something, I know that it doesn't mean inclusive in the modern social justice sense per se, but that there's something about, it's not just consistent on a nationwide level, like the Korban Tamid represents everyone in the nation, whether they're consciously part of it or not. And there seems to be something about that, like I don't know what the question was that they're answering, right? I don't know what the phrasing of the question was, but there's an implication that we're looking for something that is inclusive of the whole nation of Israel, but it's also a personal obligation that is being discharged on behalf of all of the individuals of the nation of Israel. And so that idea of inclusivity, I think, is really interesting because it's not just consistent across time, it's consistent across the people as well.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't noticed that when it was being pointed out. And I was thinking maybe because I was thinking about the on one foot story, like, oh, what's the best pasuk? What's your like favorite pasuk? But it's true that terminology is kolel yoter, like what encapsulates like what Torah is all about. It's a much grander statement about like what the foundations of Judaism are. So thank you for pointing that out. Rebecca, did you want to say something else?
I found it. I did find that first, the phraseology, and I was wondering what came before. But because it's very interesting, because so often in Judaism, we think of, maybe I'll say this way. We say, why was the first Beit HaMikdash destroyed? Because Ben Adam Makom. Why was the second Beit HaMikdash destroyed? Ben Adam L'Chavero. And that's why. And the second one was only destroyed for 70 years. And so that kind of emphasizes the idea that the mitzvot between human beings are more important. And yet it's interesting, and I'm trying to find a way to build in the interpersonal in this that because we put such emphasis on you were, how often do we remember Mitzrayim and that we were slaves, and to remembering that. So I find it very interesting that they're taking it in this direction, in much more of the between man and God and our practices.
Right. Yes. There's a focus of it being almost more personal as opposed to communal or interpersonal is huge. I will say that I think that the way that we think about korbanot now, aside from like probably being skeeved out by them and like finding them potentially morally problematic, that I think that what korbanot used to be was really different. Like I think that whole experience was much more communal. Let's say for like the korban Pesach, that's a very specific kind of korban. That was a korban that was not just sacrificed, but then like really enjoyed by a group of people. So the korban to me was not necessarily like that. But I wonder if we're kind of seeing korbanot as a kind of solipsistic experience, when for them, they saw it as an opportunity to community build, or that the Kohen was giving it to God, but it was clear that the Kohen was representing everyone, like maybe the understanding, sorry for the sirens of New York, maybe that is for them not like so necessarily just a personal experience. Like maybe for them it was seen as more, maybe we have to be thinking about korbanot in a different way. So with that, expounding on what exactly this pasuk entails, the Maharal on this shares exactly how he sees Ben Pazi's approach, which is, and I'll read the English for time's sake. And that which Ben Pazi stated, he is saying that when someone serves God with consistency and like a servant, he does not leave his service of his master, but always serves him. This relates to the verse he quoted about the everyday offering, since the entire objective is that a person should be a servant of God, and the rest of the Torah is commentary, because through the mitzvot, one serves God completely. So this really encapsulates what we were saying, and I think what people were noticing. The approach of this part of the Ein Yaakov is that the importance is about mitzvot and fulfilling mitzvot, and that's about it. what I think is important to know, because everyone is asking, what is the context? This is the beginning of the Ein Yaakov, which is a collection of Agadah. So this is how he frames it. Like, you might think, oh, well, it's important to be a servant of God, and the rest is commentary. And then his whole book is about what exactly that commentary is, about different stories that have to do with what does it mean to be a Jewish person? What does it mean to be doing good? So one can wonder, like, he is saying, the Maharal is talking about this, and then the Ein Yaakov is quoting it, but it's funny because you might think that then there isn't, that this shows that this is the most important part, and that the stories are kind of secondary, and yet like it's coming in a collection of stories. So that I think is interesting. I wonder if like he said it to kind of save himself, but to say like, oh, don't worry, I'm doing something that's rigorous and serious, even though I'm talking about all of these things. Okay, so now that we've seen that story, I find it very powerful. I think also another reason why I might find it very powerful is that the first time that I heard it in contradiction to a Christian polemic, which was that in the book of Mark, in the New Testament, there's a very similar discussion about what the most important or encapsulating pasuk in the Torah is. And they list exactly the same kinds of psukim, but Jesus says that it is the Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha that is the most important, as opposed to the giving of the sacrifices. So I remember it really sticking in my mind at the time because that felt very powerful and seemed to kind of be saying something about the nature of like, what is Judaism versus Christianity, and seeing this as a response to that, I think is really fascinating. So I felt like it was fun to share, and that's the memory that I bring with it. So now we'll look at some sources that talk about consistency in general, and some of them might be like pretty not surprising to you, and that some of them I think are a little bit more creative. And I'm hoping that by exploring what consistency can look like in a somewhat more creative way, we can have different takeaways, and hopefully you can get your reactions and thoughts to it. So a verse that is probably familiar to people here is from Pirkei Avot, which is that Shammai says, "Aseh Torah Keva." In the book of the Ethics of the Fathers, there's lots of different principles and statements about like how to live the most ethical life. And Shammai says it very clearly. It's important to get your Torah learning to be as a fixed practice. It's always nice to study Torah no matter what, but it's always helpful to be doing it constantly. I'm sure all of us can see the psychological benefit to that. So there's that. I felt like it was important to share that one, just because I feel like that might be the go-to for some of us when thinking about this. But I want to go to one that's a little bit more complicated, which is from Brachot. And it's talking about an idea that maybe we're familiar with, but I want to be thinking about it in the lens of consistency. So the machloket is about how you bless wine on different holidays and on Shabbat. Ubeit Hillel omrim, mevarech al hayayin ve'achar kach mevarech al hayom. So the question is, what kind of order do we say? When we have Kiddush, there's always a lot of different brachot within Kiddush. We're blessing the wine. We're also blessing the day. And the question is, which one should come first? So according to Beit Hillel, the answer is that we should bless the wine, so Borei Pri Gafen or Gafen, and then bless the day, right? Like let's say for Shabbat, Mekadesh HaShabbat, that's at the end. And that's Beit Hillel saying that that's the order it should be. And it seems to be that also the way you figure out the order is that there seems to be like one that is more important than the other, and therefore that one should come first. So now let's figure out why. Shayan Gorem Diktusha Shitamer. So this just has to do with the sanctity of it, but we really want the next part. Tvaracher, another version of this. Birkat Hayayin Tadira, Ubirkat Hayom Eina Tadira. Tadir Sheino Tadir Kodem. Halacha Kedivrei Beit Hillel. So another reason is that the blessing of the wine is something that we say more frequently. Ubirkat Hayom Eina Tadira. That what we say about the blessing of the day is less frequent, meaning whenever you have wine, you should be blessing Borei Pri Gafen, doesn't matter what day it is. And you're going to be saying that same blessing no matter if it's Rosh Hashanah or Shabbat. But the blessing on the day, that's definitely less frequent. I only say, you can say Mekadesh Shabbat as many Shabbatot as there are in the year, but saying Mekadesh Yisrael V'Hazmanim is only based off of certain holidays. So you're going to say it statistically less frequently than you are about the wine, because of course you're having wine in all parts of your life, and that's great because that's how people drank in the day. And there's a halachic principle that something that is more, when there are competing values of something being more frequent and then something being less frequent, it's more important that the one that is said more frequently to go first. And that's how you determine the order. And then the rest of the sugya concludes that Beit Hillel is the one we follow, and therefore this principle is followed. I'll say that it's a little bit surprising to me because when I think about what should go first, I might think, well, today's really special and it doesn't happen so often, so maybe that should go first. to kind of highlight like, oh, this is a special day, so we should be putting that on the spotlight. And this principle of tadir b'sheino tadir, tadir kodem, which appears all over the Gemara, this is just one example, suggests the exact opposite, that no, it's more important to put the thing that is more frequent, the thing that is more consistent at the forefront. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Yeah, Rebecca.
I think I go to the, we have a strong concept in Judaism of chazaka, something that has, and almost, and that obligates us, seems to obligate us. So that if you do something, we learn from it. We learn from Avraham, from Rivka, whatever, right? But we learn from people doing things. But when you do something three times, it then becomes an obligation. So I'm wondering whether tadir, that idea of that thing that's more frequent, becomes something that you have a greater obligation to. I don't know. I don't know. I'm just trying to. So you have so it almost becomes more important in that sense because it is something that you do more frequently.
Yes. So you bring up the point of chazaka, which is good because that's going to be the next example that we go to. So I'll have more to say about that then. I think that is a good point. Like, I think that it has to do with frequency and therefore has to do with, you think, well, the thing that's going to appear in my life more, that must mean that it's more important. Thinking about it that way might help. So let's go to the next source since it talks about chazaka. When I was looking for sources, I thought, well, it'd be really good to show the example of a chazaka, that if you do something 3 times, that halachically it sticks enough that it becomes something that you are now bound to do. And I found it quite difficult to find sources for that, which I think is very interesting in light of this conversation about what the nature of consistency is, because I think it's something that we all sociologically kind of are familiar with, at least in the modern Orthodox world. And it's hard to find an actual source for it, but I found an interesting place in which it appears, which is the next source. So this is from the Machzor. This is from Hatarat Nedarim. Before Rosh Hashanah, we appear in front of a makeshift Beit Din, and very similar to Kol Nidrei, we list all of the potential vows that we made, and we say, well, or not list, but we acknowledge all of the vows that we made, and we say, even though we meant them significantly, we don't actually mean them now. We hope that we will not be judged for them if we do not follow them through. And so there's all these amazing lists of what they are. I remember, like, when I did it this past year, what stuck out to me is one of the vows is like that I didn't take on a vow of Nizirut like Shimshon and all of these like fun things. So it's a very long list in your Koren Siddur. It takes up like way over a page. And here it says exactly what a chazaka is. So you start off the prayer, Shimuna Rabotai, listen, rabbis, the Beit Din, Tainim Mumachim, established judges, Kol Neder, O Shua, O Isar, O Kanam, O Cherem Shenidarti, O Nishpati V'Akitz, O Bachalom, O Nishpati V'Shemot HaKadoshim, Sheinam Nimchakim, V'Shem Havaya, Baruch Hashem. So listing all of these different kinds of oaths, oaths, swearing, if you were in a dream you made it. It's very pedantic, and you can see that there was a lot of desire to cover ground just in case, although it's a little bit excessive. And then they start listing all of the different vows. Maybe I made a vow that in my heart that I decided I was going to take on a certain mitzvah. Maybe I wanted to take on some kind of action or good deed. So there it says, not just that I thought about it in the heart, but that I actually maybe even did it 3 times. And yet I'm asking now for you to not count that. So by having this as just like part of the repertoire of what we're saying, it shows that there is a value to something happening 3 times. And so that is my source, I would say, for chazakah. There isn't other sources really that have that, which I think is interesting. And it seems here that this idea of chazakah, that if you're doing something 3 times, I'm going to guess aside from 3, I guess, like being some kind of typological number, that there's like a psychology to it. If you're doing something more than once, and then 3 is like more than just twice, that probably there's some real deep meaning behind what you're doing and desire to do it. So you can do one action sporadically once, but that's not actually the best way to have a judge of character. I think that's what's happening here when we think about this idea of chazakah, enough that you need to have Nidre to like undo it, or Hatzar Nidre to undo it. It's significant enough. I think that is yet another source for the importance of consistency. Okay. The next source that I have is from Rashi, and it's a pasuk. It's a commentary on a pasuk that is from the beginning of the Tochacha in Vayikra. The Tochacha is the section of Vayikra that talks about if we decide not to do all the mitzvot that God wants, here are all the bad things that are going to happen. But the way that that is prefaced is im telchu mikeri, which is saying that if you decide to like walk away from me or walk with me and then leave, and they're focusing on the word carry. And the way that Rashi understands this is kind of like mikre, like an incident or a happening. And Rashi is saying that this means, and this is the nature of how the Tochacha and like all the bad things will begin, as if walking with God is only a happenstance thing. That if walking with God is not something that you're consistently doing, but only happens every once in a while, that is setting up the foundation for bad things happening. So that feels pretty intense to me, I would say. I think that like when we think about at least like divine connection is like sometimes when I'm davening, I'm not necessarily feeling it, or it doesn't feel fully in my control to feel like I'm walking with God. But the idea is that if it only is something almost happenstance, that's the setup for disaster. And that is the foundation for all the bad things happening. This one feels a little harsher than the other ones. But yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that? Maybe it's important to be that harsh to kind of set routine.
I'm thinking about a contrast. So just sort of sparked by you saying sometimes, you daven, but you're not feeling it in that moment. Earlier, the first source you had, the one that you said kind of typifies the way people usually think about consistency is like that you should make your learning keva, right? Like a fixed practice. But there's another Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, I'm paraphrasing, I may not get the wording exactly right, but it says, "Aseh tfilatcha keva ein bo tachanunim," right? It's like if you make your tefillah keva, then it won't be effective at getting God's mercy. So there's this like tension on what keva means. Like keva is good in learning, but bad in tefillah. And so what's the difference between doing something regularly versus doing something sort of by rote or by habit or unthinkingly, that we're trying to make designated time or make something sort of an inherent part of ourselves without making it automatic to the point of being substanceless? And that feels like a really difficult line to walk in these sources, I think. And I think that's why the harshness is jumping out at me, because, making sure that you have the right balance of keva in your relationship with God seems like a tough challenge.
Yeah. So we're going to get to that source later. So thank you for bringing it up now. That'll be a good.
Sorry to jump.
No. I think it's helpful. And what's helpful is also we're going to look at the Gemara on that in particular, where we're going to see like different levels of what you're talking about, kind of expressing how this is like a little bit more of a spectrum. I think what you're bringing up is good. Like the harshness feels hard because as much as routine is something that is somewhat in our control, if we have a good, agenda and like easy schedule, that also the sense of consistency is about being able to feel connection, and connection isn't really something that is in our control, no matter how much that we can actually try. And it's picking up on that issue. Yeah.
I would just, it's Rebecca. I was just going to say, and I'll wait till the further source, learning and tefillah are so different. So you can understand why your approach to them would be different. Tefillah is the same thing over and over. Learning, if you're learning, you're tackling a different issue each time. But I will be patient and wait till you get to that source.
Great. Thank you. Jonathan, do you want to say something?
So, once you brought in this idea of mitzvot and tefillah and consistency, and I was just wondering if there's sort of like a case study with like Mashiva Roch and Merida Geshem, right? Where like once you've gotten through a month of saying it, it's assumed, if you can't remember if you said it or not in your Shemona Esrei, once you're through a month of saying it consistently, you assume that you said it. You don't have to go back and repeat your Shemona Esrei if you think you skipped it. Whereas if you're within that month and you haven't built up that consistency, then you assume that you missed it. But going back to what Zahava was saying in terms of like this whole like tefillah, or what you were saying, sorry, but tefillah and doing it by rote, it seems with Mashiv HaRuach and Merid HaGeshem that it's actually of benefit that it becomes rote, because then you can assume that you said it as opposed to that you missed it if you're not sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great study actually, because I also don't, as much as it might be comforting to think, well, after a month, it doesn't really matter. Like it's remembering if I said it or not. And like that feels comforting. There's also a part of it that's like, wait a minute, like it doesn't matter. Like that feels painful. And also that sounds like we're automatically assuming that like it's so built into our psyches at that point that we're saying it and we don't know what we're even saying. Like we're just saying it for the sake of, and that feels like mechanistic and almost magical. I feel like that often with like the Slichot season also, like with Hashem Kal Rachu V'Chanun, often like by Ne'ilah, I'm like, okay, this is the last time. I gotta go for it. But there's also something really mechanistic about it where I'm saying all these attributes of God, and whether I'm like fully into it or not, somehow that's like changing the fabric of the universe, and that's like cool and also weird, and I don't know, not really the Judaism that I'm used to, but seems to be a model of tefillah. So yeah, I think that's a really great example. So before we get to Zahava's good quote, I have one more pro-consistency source for you, which is taking a little bit more of a moralistic bent to this, which is not necessarily about like certain kinds of halachot, but is about the nature of character. And some of you might be familiar with the story of Rabban Gamliel getting kicked out of the Beit Midrash. A lot of people were very angry with how he treated Rabbi Yehoshua, who was a fellow colleague of his, and he always would shame him whenever they disagreed. And it got so bad that then he was kicked out of the Beit Midrash, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah steps in. But when Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah steps in, they reflect on the new changes in the nature of the Beit Midrash, and then they talk about something that Rabban Gamliel used to admire. So it says, Tana oto hayom silkuhu l'shomer hapetach v'nina lahem reshut l'talmidim likanes. So something that changed on that day, as in the day that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah now became in charge of the new Beit Midrash, there used to be a guard at the door, and they sent the guard away because there used to be a guard that actually was guarding and keeping out certain students from coming in. But there were students that really wanted to be a part of the Beit Midrash, but then there was a guard there stopping them. And the question is, what criteria was the guard stopping them for? Shaya Rabban Gamliel machriz ve'omer kol tamid she'in tilcho kevaro lo yikanes leBeit HaMidrash. Because Rabban Gamliel used to say, would proclaim and say, that any student that does not have their insides matching their outsides cannot come into the Beit Midrash. So that's a fun image, but it seems here that there's a level of authenticity that that Rabban Gamliel seems to be correlating with consistency, right? Like that your outsides and your insides are the same. That seems to suggest a judgment of character, and that judgment of character, that if those things are consistent, that's what allows them into the Beit Midrash, which I think is interesting. I think that in a world of, I don't know if it's 2022 or like my young sense of self jaded with politics, maybe we're like all jaded with politics, the idea of someone having like an inside that is different than their outsides is very upsetting, and doesn't seem to show someone who is trustworthy or honorable. But at the same time, in this story, Rabban Gamliel is the one who gets kicked out in the end. And so I think that's a really interesting framing here of like, it seems to be saying like, yes, consistency in how one acts seems to suggest like a good sense of character. And at the same time, are we really going to bar other students from coming in who don't necessarily have that? Or also, you know, what actually is determined, how has one determined if their insides match their outsides, right? There was like no criteria actually expressed. So I think that this is an interesting approach that hopefully could speak to those less halachically inclined in the audience for like all the nice shaklavataria of that, but instead want like more of a moralistic read of why consistency might be significant. I think this is an interesting way to see it. Does anyone have any comments they want to share about that? Okay. All right, now it's time to get to Zahava's problem. The problem of consistency. So this is from the Mishnah, and it says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, ha'oseh tfilato keva, ein tfilato tachanunim. Rabbi Eliezer says, anyone who makes their tefillah or their davening consistent, right, that there's like fixed times for it, that tefillah doesn't have the same power to have supplications. It doesn't like have the same power to move God in the same way, which is a very loaded statement. So of course, the Gemara has to unpack it a bit. And so the Gemara does this by saying, well, what does it actually mean for something to be keva, for something to be fixed? And I think that the way that they explain what this could mean expresses like some of the problems that have begun to arise. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Ide, Amar Rabbi Oshaya, kol shetfilato doma alav kimasoi. So there, the issue is that consistency might entail that tefillah feels similar to a burden that you're carrying. Okay, well, we can unpack what that means in a minute. Okay, this is referring to anyone who's just like davening in general, not praying with tachnunim. Like different parts of the Amida have, you know, some of us are praying for good crops and having intellect, and we're not actually like begging for things to change. And maybe that's the issue, that we're not like praying for the right things. Rabba and Rav Yosef and Rav Yosef say, this is referring to anyone who davens, and maybe it's okay that it's happening at a fixed time, but they're not providing something new to the table. And I think that these are really interesting analysis of what the issue could be that Rabbi Eliezer is concerned with. So, Zahav, I don't want to call you out because I know that I don't know where exactly you are, but like I'm curious if some of these explanations like help the concerns you were having before, if they make them more complicated, and anyone else can jump in as well. I think they're like really interesting examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think the introduce a novel element, right? Yachol lechadesh badavar is interesting because it assumes that the container is consistent and the contents must be new, kind of. Right? It's okay to always daven mincha at 3 p.m. and to always, you know, but you can't always say the same words, or you can't say them in the same way. I don't know if I have a good handle on what the language of tachanunim means, so I'm reluctant to comment on that part of it.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, supplication in English is like a tough enough word as is, I guess. But I think it means like real, like asking for things. Rebecca, did you want to say more about what you put in the comment in the chat?
Oh, so we can say about that. I mean, I was going to respond to this. I'm not sure that that's what Rabbi Gamliel was talking about, consistency. Like I love what you're doing here, but I'm not 100% sure, because I think he was judging people and etc. But going on this, I mean, so Zahava, I don't think it's at like doing it at 3 o'clock. It's just that they're saying the same words with route in, like, it's, we can all recite Shemona Esrei, right? And just recite it. And sometimes you get to the end and you say, did I say that right? Like did I actually say everything there? Yeah. Or not. The question becomes, have I found meaning in it? And I think that, to my mind, that's what would be the Tachmanim would be. Have I been able to bring something, something new, maybe not to all the bracha, but even to something in it? Have I been able to make it different, or been able to relate to it in some unique way? As that ends.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think that there's definitely this wide array of approaches here, and there is taking into account like what exactly are tachnunim. But I do think what this can show, regardless, is that there are good ways to do consistency and there are bad ways to do consistency, right? That consistency itself isn't necessarily the problem, but it's about how we approach it. It's possible to do consistency and for it to feel like a burden, and that's when it becomes a problem. When we see it as something that's kind of, infringing on our lives, as opposed to maybe slowly building up towards a sense of connection. That's the issue. And also, Rav Yosef seemed to be suggesting that that maybe the issue is, right, that there is nothing new added, no novel elements. But maybe the solution is to have a sense of consistency that also still has a novel element, which is where I want to go next. That's where I want to end off, which is, I don't think there's ever clear, like, oh, obviously doing consistency is like totally correct, and then doing something novel is totally correct. It's always going to be some kind of mix of the two. But hopefully this end part can help us think about what that balance can look like. So this pasuk from Vayikra is talking about the Ner Tamid, which is the eternal flame, but that manifests now in our own shuls as that little light that's on top of our own Kodesh that's on all the time. The commandment comes, Tzava b'nei Yisrael v'yikhu elecha Hashem and zayit zach kati lamaor lalo ner tamid. There's a commandment to light a ner tamid. But what's very interesting about this is there's a commandment to light it, but it's not understood here as lighting once and then forever it's done. I mean, candles burn out. But there's a commandment to constantly light the ner tamid, to constantly light the eternal flame, which seems somewhat paradoxical, right? If it's an eternal flame, there's no need to relight it. But built into the idea of ner tamid is this idea that you constantly have to come back and light it again, which means that this can be a model for us of what consistency can look like, right? That consistency could seem like the eternal, like something that is constant, never changing. But by having to come relight, we have to bring ourselves anew to that every single day. And that is what is constantly burning. And I think probably a verse that might be the most familiar to us, more so than the ner tamid, would be from our davening. So this is at the beginning of the miracle of Kriyat Shema. God illuminates the earth and provides light for those who dwell on it with compassion, and in God's goodness renews every day continually the work of creation. So that's nice. I don't even fully know what that means, but I think what's important here is this idea of mechadesh b'chol yom, that you are renewing, but you're renewing every single day. So you're doing something new, but you're also doing it constantly. And I think that this addresses that tension, and also addresses that the idea of consistency and novelty don't necessarily have to be against each other. We might think they are initially when we hear the term consistency, but that our goal should be about doing those two things together. Yes, Dr. Freudenstein.
I'm a little surprised. I'm going to play this Sofia card and bring up God for that last example from the beginning of the Shema that I do love. That it is the repetition, the constant, this a task that is a daily task, but it shifts it away from a pure psychology discussion where we are kind of veering and bringing it back to a partnership with God, and which would then be ongoing, daily, things like that. Like it's not just tefillah and learning on a regular basis to make us better people. It's within the framework of a divine plan.
Right, that God is doing the mechadesh here, you're saying.
Well, no, it's the partnership. I love about that particular part of the bracha is it really makes us feel like, for me at least, like a partner in creation, which is like a huge responsibility, of course. But it's an ongoing, I was going to say battle, but it's an ongoing
dance. Yeah.
And but at least I can have a partner in that and not have to bear it alone by participating with God in some way in a creative process.
Right. I mean, I think God would also be a great example of kind of this back and forth where God definitionally is like beyond, like it is eternal, but also does interact with us. I mean, this like could go down a whole rabbit hole of like Jewish theology for thousands of years. How can God have emotions? How could God change things if God doesn't change? But I think that without figuring that out, because no one has, to recognize that all of these things can exist in one. And that might even be like what Jewish theology is, that God is both eternal and yet God cares about us, which is something that like seems to be something that is a little bit more limiting. That all that can be existence at one, that like actually more so represents the messiness of life, and then also our own connection to Avodat Hashem. I think that that's a great connection. Does anyone else have anything to share? Okay. Well, the last source I want to end off with, I don't think there's a need to go into it, but I wanted it in case people wanted the source. There's an idea that Shlomo finished building the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Mar Cheshvan. But then he waited and locked it up for a year because he really wanted to open it during the month of Tishrei when Abraham was born. So he wanted to honor Abraham that way. But then, like, poor Cheshvan, it got kind of left behind. And yet the idea is that even though that's the case, God promises that the third Beit HaMikdash is going to reopen or be created in Cheshvan. So we could say, oh no, we just said Cheshvan like has nothing in it, and now we're like adding something fancy. No, I don't think that's the point of this Sikta Rabati. I think the point here is everything that's been encapsulating what we've been talking about. Cheshvan is a boring month. But maybe we shouldn't be using the term boring and using an opportunity for consistency. We've just had like this amazing ecstasy of Tishrei, and it's been so exciting. We've maybe made a ton of commitments for the upcoming year, and we need to be able to test out to see if that's actually going to hold up. And the way to do that isn't to have more and more fantastical events, but it's important to have some downtime. And that actually maybe this sense of consistency, the sense of maybe a little bit more quiet, a little more Shabbatot, as Dalia pointed out earlier, that's actually, that attitude is really what is going to bring the merit of the Mashiach. That it's always great to have these fantastical moments, but ultimately about what you do in the everyday and what is easy and accessible to you and build into your schedule, that's really what we should be judging ourselves on, not for these crazy flashes of inspiration or connection. And then that ultimately is what is going to bring the world to come. And I'm sure for a lot of us here in different relationships that we've had, that seems to be the case. You can have like your anniversaries, or you can have your birthdays, but really about what we do throughout the year, that's really what builds a relationship, even some of the somewhat more stereotypical boring things. And that can be also our model for relationship with God. So hopefully that's what Cheshvan can be for us. And we can also have the hope that doing these actions, even if they might sometimes seem like rote, but hopefully trying to find the chidush, the novelty in them, will bring the world to come. And that is my blessing for us all for this upcoming Cheshvan. Does anyone have any questions? That's all I have here for you today.
Now, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much. Thank you for coming.
And I'll add one last word of thanks. I'm so happy that we were able to have you with us. I think the range of your scholarship and also your clear personal investment in the messages that you're giving us. It's so practical, but also so philosophical. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate you coming for us.
Here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, everyone should have a Chodesh Tov and volunteer for some teaching in the months following Adar or Nisan. I don't remember which one, but we can have 2 people on Nisan. That's fine. Have a great night, everybody. Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Chodesh Tov.